Hello, it's Lou Collins and I'm here with another video for you with my textures range. This is the first collection, it's called Reflections, and today I'm going to be focusing on the stamp set. This is the Owl stamp set because this is really unique actually. I've not seen anything like this before, which is why we wanted to do it. And yeah, I love it. I love the different textures in it. So we've got a bit like a distressed dot, we've got a gorgeous damask, again it's quite vintage around this edge. We've got the book print or the newsprint in there as well, and then we've got the vintage letters on this side. So they are 4 separate stamps. Now the great thing about these is they do coordinate with the die set as well, the textured layered owl there. So we have an outer die that comes with the owl, and you can see that fits perfectly around the edge of these, so you can cut out your panels ready to stamp onto if you want to, or stamp and then die cut. And of course the layering die or layered die there for the owl also will fit inside, and you can put the backgrounds around him if you want to. So there's lots of different options for using them together. So I'm going to start first of all by stamping this beautiful text side here onto some black cardstock. Now before I stamp it, I'm actually going to die cut it out just so that I've got a guideline for myself. So I'm going to use the smaller of the matting and layering dies from the die set to do that. There we go. Now one thing I love to do before I do any embossing is to always take the static away from my paper, and also any greasy finger marks and things. This just makes heat embossing so much easier, and that's what I'm going to be doing here. Because I'm going on to black, I'm going to heat emboss with a gorgeous gold colour. It's a little bit like a platinum colour. I'm absolutely obsessed with this embossing powder from Sizzix that Pete Hughes has just released. It is like a platinum, it's a gold stroke silver, it is just stunning, it's a beautiful colour. So I'm going to be using that on the black to really show up. These are really good quality stamps here. We made sure we could get the best quality possible for you. So I'm going to be using these. They stick to the acrylic blocks absolutely perfectly, but as you can see they fit just right inside of the die there. So I'm going to bring in quite a large stamping platform. You need a stamping platform that will stamp up to A5 to use the larger border dies. First of all, put down my cardstock. Now the cardstock that I die cut out was actually a textured one on one side, so I'm stamping on the reverse, which is the smoother side. I'm just going to tack that down there, reposition my stamp again, make sure I'm happy with the position of that, and then lift my stamp up onto my platform. There we go. And now I can put that over there. That's not going to touch anything. I'm going to take an embossing ink and just ink this entire stamp up. Now this is beautiful because all 4 stamps together will create an A5 base or background for a card, but of course you can just use one on its own, and this will make a much smaller card if that's what you want to use. So just place that back in the stamping platform, and I'm just going to press that down. Now the great thing about this platform is you can press up and down a few times if you want to, and really make sure you've got all the detail. The beauty of these images is because of the distressed nature of them. If you miss any spots when you're stamping, particularly if you don't have a stamping platform, if you're using an acrylic block, or maybe if your ink isn't as wet as you'd like and the heat embossing doesn't quite work as well as you'd like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really show because it's so distressed, which actually makes life much easier. So I'm just going to bring in some paper here so that I can catch my embossing powder and sprinkle this all over the top. Tap that off. I mean, that already, without even heating it, looks lovely and vintage, but I am going to heat set this quickly. There we go. So there's that texture in that owl, which is beautiful, and I love that we have the border around the edge as well, so it just finishes it off. It almost makes it look as if it's curved, because you have the dark shadow around the edge. The next thing I'm going to do is die cut the decorative owl here. This is our textured owl. It's a nested die set, so we do have the nesting dies which we use for the outline. Just the owl for this because he can sit nicely inside of this shape. So I'm going to just die cut him and leave the cardstock inside the die. So just release that. Now we've got a lovely aperture there, and of course don't forget your stamps will fit nicely inside of that aperture if you want to do something with this sort of effect. So don't throw your apertures away, they're really pretty. So what I'm going to do now is, keeping the paper inside, or the cardstock inside of there, I'm actually going to just bring in again a sheet of cardstock to protect my base, and I'm going to use an embossing ink pad. Now you can use, if you want to, something like a foam applicator to do this, particularly if you've got one like this, which is a mini one, which will get inside all the detail. But I found actually if you've got a nice juicy ink pad and you're not too concerned with the top of it getting a few little scratches in the pad, then this is fine to do. I'm just going to use my ink pad directly over my die here, and just in little circles just rub over the surface of the die, pressing ink into the detail of the owl there. I really want to concentrate on this left hand side because that's the side that I'm going to be using for this, and not the right hand side too much. So you can easily tell when you release this whether or not you've got the detail all through properly, which I can there, because you can see the cardstock is actually darker through there. So what I'm going to do now is turn this over. I'll clean my die in a moment, and I'm going to use this embossing powder again over the top, the same colour as I just used. I mean, just about halfway. I don't want to waste any powder that I'm not going to use. In fact, do you know what? You can do the whole owl. You can use the other half for something else. Just tap that off, and you can see that detail there has come through. One thing I didn't do there, which like I say I always like to do or prefer to do, is to use my anti-static bag. So there's a few areas that have a little bit of powder on, but not to worry. I will just tap off my excess back into the jar and put the lid on, because I'm very clumsy. So I just need to make sure I don't make a mess with that or waste any of the powder, because like I say, it's one of my favourite powders so far that I've ever seen. I'm just going to heat this. There we go. Now that is really beautiful. That is a stunning, stunning owl, just as it is. You don't need to do anything else to that if you don't want to. I'm going to take a gel pen, and I'm just going to fill in a little bit of detail around the eye. Now this is where the die has tiny detail, and sometimes you don't always get your embossing ink in there very well. So I'm just going to take a silver gel pen, go around that, and then we'll move on. Okay, so as you can see, the owl sits beautifully over there, but we only want half of this owl. So I'm going to take a ruler. I'm going to place it down half of the owl here. If anything, just a little more than half, just to be on the safe side. And I'm going to lift this side up, tearing down the middle. If you prefer to do this with scissors, you of course can. You may prefer to leave the owl whole, that's entirely up to you. Okay, so the next stage is to do our background using our background stamp. So I'm going to pop this part to the side for now, using the grid that's on a stamping block. Now not all stamping blocks will have these, but if you do have one, or if you have a stamping block that's clear and you can use a grid on your mat, it's a good idea to do that just to get the edges straight, as this is quite a large stamp. So there's one. Then I'm also going to place this one right next to it and do the same. Work up the lines, and that should fit nicely there. So then you'll see that your owl sits nicely inside of that background. Perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to do embossing again. I'm going to use embossing ink. I don't have a preference with embossing inks. I have a couple of ink pads on the go. I have the Distress embossing ink. I also have this one from Sukaniko. There's lots of different embossing inks on the market. So like I say, I don't really have too much of a preference. I just go with whatever's nice and juicy at the time. I must admit, as soon as they start drying up, I don't use them anymore and I move on to a nice new one because I like to make sure I'm getting my detail. So I've just inked all of that up. I'm quickly going to use my anti-static bag again, just over or around the edges, make sure that I get a nice clean impression, blowing away any excess there. I'm going to stamp this down. Now this is a clear ink going onto white paper, so you're not going to be able to unfortunately see anything, but what I'm going to do now is use a clear embossing powder over the top of this clear stamping, and then we'll do some inking and you'll be able to see all the beautiful colours coming through. So there, although you probably can't really see it, trying to catch the light, but I have the clear embossing there in the background. It's very, very subtle. I'm going to bring in a blending mat now. So just getting my inks together. I'm going to use old paper. I was going to use tea dye, but I think I might actually go even darker and use Vintage Photo as well. So I'm going to blend from one to the other from the bottom down. So I'll start first of all with the paler colour, and I'm going to load lots of ink up onto my brush there, although you can't really see it, and just go from the mat in circles onto the paper, and there we can now start to really see that gorgeous embossing coming through. So you can see those distressed dots, and you can see the damask on the side as well. Now I'm going to trim this down so that this really hits the very edges. I'm going to take this old paper colour and I'm going to run this around about almost 2/3 of the way down the paper. Let's say I'm not too worried about the middle section, it's the edges that we're working on. So now I'm going to just clean my brush off as best I can onto the old towel, and then do the same with the Vintage Photo. This is a much darker colour. It'll create a nice blend between the two. And with the darker colours you can see that gorgeous embossing even better. So really solid brown at the bottom, and then just start to fade up into the old paper colour. In fact, that old paper colour to me is a little bit green. I may go over that with more of a creamy, like antique linen perhaps, colour instead. So I think I'll do that just to tone down the green and make it more of a yellow or a beigey colour. So again, clean my brush off. Oh yes, that's much better. It gives it more of a vintage look. The green would clash with the blue that we've die cut from, so I didn't want that. So the yellow, more yellow tone is perfect. I'm going to bring that ink down into the Vintage Photo there. So we've got a nice blend from dark to light there. So I've gone round the edge there and trimmed that down, and you can see we've got all that texture in the background, which I love. I'm going to add to the texture a little bit more, not that we'll see a great deal of it, but I'm just going to spritz some water onto my hand and just flick it onto some of the distressing there, and that will just add some little blotches. You'll see it more in the middle, but it will be present around the edge also, and that just adds to that distressed look. So I'm going to spray that with some water, let that sit only for 20 seconds or so, not very long at all, and then I think that's about ready to go. You can really see it's changed at the top here. The darker bits at the bottom, taking a little bit longer, but they are starting to go, and that really gives it that vintage look. So I'm just using the other side of my towel to lift that up. And there we go, and make sure this is all dry as well. I'm just going to dry that off, because when it comes to gluing this down in a little while, I don't want this to have any dampness to it, because that will affect the glue. So just make sure it's all reasonably dry. It also lightens the colour very slightly again. There we go. So now we can see that our owl will sit beautifully in the centre there, then have that distressing around the edge, and then we have our other textured owl as well. So you can see how they're all starting to work together really beautifully. I absolutely love how these come together so quickly. So what I'm going to do to finish this off is I'm going to mat around the edge with a black cardstock and then put it onto a white card base. So there's the owl. I actually changed my mind and I matted the background on with a blue, the navy blue cardstock, the same as I did the owl, because I thought that brought the blue in a bit more. And do you know what, I love that. I love the reflections, I love the layers that we've got, all of the texture, we've got the different colours, but I don't think it even needs a sentiment. Now of course you can put a sentiment. We have some really gorgeous word dies that are included in the Reflections range, the First Textures collection. We've got 4 of those. There's Amazing, Celebrate, Beautiful and Best Wishes, so you can incorporate those. We then also have the label stamps. These are really good fun. They're like your label printer sort of stamped words. You can stamp them any colour. We've got them in black on the backing sheet, but of course you can stamp them in any colour, and we have the die to cut those out all at the same time as well if you want to, rather than do them individually. We also have the typewriter font, which is my favourite font ever, and to mix it with brush lettering is brilliant. So we have both the uppercase and the lowercase, and of course you can then create your own sentiments, your own names, your own words. So you could absolutely be putting a banner across this if you wanted to, or write your own message, or otherwise you could stamp on the inside of the card your own little message or sentiment in there. So there's him, and that's one way you can use those gorgeous textured stamps.